Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to rise this morning to speak on Part 3 of the bill. Mr. Hipkins has just been discussing the folly of the government in bringing this particular proposal forward. I note in the regulatory impact statement around Part 3 of this bill the following statement: the voluntary repayment bonus is part of a wider student support package and is not a standalone policy. And that is never a truer word said in a regulatory impact statement, Mr. Chair, because the government's overall student support package in this budget is one where the message is very, very clear indeed. If you are from a low-income background, this government doesn't want you undertaking postgraduate study. That's the message from this budget, from the student support package in this budget. Because to be absolutely clear about what the government did yesterday, it said that student allowances will not be available for anyone studying postgraduate qualifications. Anyone at all from 2013. And Mr. Chair, if we look at this measure as part of that package, as the regulatory impact statement tells us to do, we can see quite clearly that in fact Mr. Joyce's answer to people who say, I cannot get a student allowance, how am I going to be able to do postgraduate study, is to take on more debt through the student loan scheme. The very thing that the government told us they didn't want, the very thing that's meant to sit at the heart of the so-called student support package, is that there will actually now be more debt for students if they're going to be able to carry on. And a very important point on that, Mr. Chair, is that students who currently receive an allowance for postgraduate study in most cases will be getting far more than the $171 a week that is paid out in the student loan scheme living costs component, Mr. Chair. So the overall package of student support, of which this voluntary repayment bonus repeal is part of, is actually a package of declining support. It's actually restricting the access for allowances and meaning that many people who would have been undertaking postgraduate study will not be doing so, Mr. Chair, and that is a great shame. It is something that is going to limit the potential of many New Zealanders and add to the debts that they and their families have. It is a retrograde step, and as part of this wider package of student support is simply not on. Mr. Chair, this particular measure in Part 3, we're told by the regulatory impact statement, is designed to encourage greater contribution to tertiary education costs from students who can most afford to pay and who are more likely to receive higher levels of private return from their study, and to reduce unnecessary borrowing. Well, the very thing this package of student support will do is increase borrowing, and the notion that a greater contribution to tertiary education costs from students who can most afford to pay. That's what this regulatory impact statement says. Students who can most afford to pay. The students who are on student allowances now are people who cannot afford to pay for their tertiary, for their postgraduate qualifications. And this government is saying to those people, we will not support you into postgraduate study. We need more people going into postgraduate study. We want more people qualifying with masters and PhDs to help grow the economy. But because there's nothing in this budget about growing the economy anyway, Mr. Chair, this government has said, well, we're not going to bother with actually supporting people into those postgraduate qualifications. The voluntary repayment bonus, Mr. Speaker, was, as my colleague Mr. Hipkins said, brought in by the national government in 2009, and they decided that this would be a good way of getting borrowers to pay off their loan more quickly. Now, I just want to note at that point John Key and Stephen Joyce's recent conversion to the idea that the thing which will allow people to pay off their loans more quickly is the interest-free nature of the student loan scheme, something the Labor government was heavily criticised for by National. John Key said he would oppose that policy with every bone in his body, but now he's realised actually that is what's allowing people to pay their loans off quicker, because the scheme that they put up to try to get people to pay their loans off quicker actually didn't work. And in fact, the one thing that did work was the interest-free nature of it. But that was the goal of this. But the regulatory impact statement, Mr. Chair, tells us that Despite the fact that the goal of this policy was to pay people to pay their loan off more quickly, many borrowers who undertook it were actually already the very people who were paying their loans off quickly. And the bonus, it says, is also encouraging some students to borrow when they do not need to do so. So the policy actually had exactly the opposite effect of what Mr. Chair, of what the government said they wanted to do. The regulatory impact statement tells us that in 2011, 2,611 borrowers repaid their student loans in the same year they borrowed. So actually they were gaming the system, which is what the Labour Party told the national government would happen. Mr. Chair, if the national government wants people to pay off their loans more quickly, they should make tertiary education more affordable. They should actually support students to study. They should make sure that fees don't go up. They should give more people access to student allowances if they want to make tertiary education more affordable, which is what they said was the goal of this policy. Instead, what they did was run up a failed policy that was doomed to failure. And it's not just, as Mr Hipkins said, Anne Tolley or Peter Dunn or Louise Upston who was hugely behind this policy. John Key trumpeted it in a press release of the 31st of January 2008. He said that he was announcing a plan to help student loan holders get out of debt quicker. Well, that didn't work out very well. He says we're going to keep interest-free student loans. Good on you, John. That's well done. But many of them have financial decisions based on this current policy, and this is what Mr Key said. We want to ensure they can plan with certainty. That's what John Key said in 2009, in 2008, saying that this policy would be introduced so that students and their families can plan with certainty. Well, here we are, 3 years later, certainty's out the window because the policy just didn't work. But John Key said he wanted students to plan with certainty. That is not what happened. And so he said, what I've announced today is aimed at helping borrowers to get out of debt sooner. That didn't happen. And give them certainty so that they can plan. That didn't happen. And then we have the following statement from John Key. National has no intention of doing anything that impedes people from realising their own educational ambitions. Let's read that again. National has no intention of doing anything that impedes people from realising their own educational ambitions. There are words for that I am not allowed to use in this House, but we can look at the budget, Mr Chair, and it tells us for sure that the impeding of people achieving their educational ambitions will be happening as a result of this budget. If allowances are taken away from anyone trying to do postgraduate study, that impedes educational ambition. I have had students contacting me via social media, via email over the last 24 hours saying, I can table them if you like, Mr Henniday. I'll do it for you later. And I'd like you, Mr Henniday, to go and talk to some constituents. You don't have an electorate anymore, but talk to some constituents and actually ask them about how this is going to impact on them. Because what this means for the students who have contacted me is people in master's programs, partway through master's programs, who are now not going to be able to carry on. These are people who have planned, have families, have planned for this. They are halfway through a master's program, to a third of the way through a PhD program, and they will not be able to get the allowances to allow them to carry on. So Mr Key tells us that National has no intention of doing anything that impedes people realising their own educational ambitions. This budget impedes people realising their educational ambition. It increases the repayment rate on student loans. It says that student allowances are only for rich people to do postgraduate qualifications. That's what the message is from this budget. This bill, part 3 of this bill, is part of a student support package that is actually about limiting the number of people who can go into tertiary education. Stephen Joyce's goal from day one as Minister of Tertiary Education was to dampen demand. They were his words. Dampen demand for tertiary education. That is the opposite of what this country should be doing, Mr Chair. This country should be encouraging more people into tertiary education, more people into training, more people into postgraduate qualifications. But instead, this government is determined to take money away from supporting students to do that. Mr Chair, that is a great shame. Part 3 of this bill repeals something the government should never have done. It was a silly part of their package, but what they really should do is be putting forward proposals that actually enable participation, that enable people to carry on with the study that they want to do so that they can get qualifications that will get them higher incomes, that will support their families and that will add to economic growth for New Zealand. We have seen none of that in this budget from the government. What we have seen is simply a proposal to get rid of a silly policy they had in the first place. I want to see a commitment from this government to more people doing postgraduate qualifications. That will not happen.
Andrew Little.